to be back at North Greenville University. 32 wonderful years I called this home, and it still feels like home. It was a good place to be then. It is a good place to be now. And I am glad to be with you this morning. You know, it's amazing. Every song that we sang here is what I'm going to say to you today. Now keep your seat. You're going to hear it again. Just because you already heard it doesn't mean you can leave. It just means I hope the Lord's prepared our hearts through the singing for the hearing of His Word. But it is certainly a joy. We're going to look at Jeremiah chapter 1. This is Jeremiah's call experience. He finds out here what God has in store for him for the future, and he is not happy about it. Okay? But we'll give you a little preview in the end. He's going to be happy about it. Everything is going to be just fine. Jeremiah chapter 1, beginning with verse 5, God speaking here says to Jeremiah, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said," this is Jeremiah's response, "Ah, Lord God, behold, I don't know how to speak, for I'm only a youth." But the Lord said to me, "Do not say I'm only a youth. For to all whom I send you, you shall go, and whatever I command you to speak, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord." Then the Lord put his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, "Behold, I have put my words in your mouth." The other day, I was scrolling down when I had some leisure time, Facebook, some posts there, and noticed a lady had posted, "I am really anxious about the future. I've been out of the workforce since my children were small, since my children were born, and I'm starting a job tomorrow, and I am really anxious about it." And some very kind, caring soul responded and said, "Don't be anxious. You've got this. You've got this." That's become very popular. I looked down a few days later, I saw a student getting ready to defend his doctoral dissertation. Pretty important. He let it be known he was pretty anxious about that, and somebody wrote on there, "Don't be anxious. You've got this thing." Now, if that little casual saying would have been around during Jeremiah's day, and Jeremiah would have explained to him what he had just gone through, this daunting task that was before him, some kind soul would have said to him, "Jeremiah, don't be anxious. You've got this." Jeremiah would have said, "Thank you for your kindness, but I don't got this." Okay? I don't have this. It is not in me. I am not up to this daunting task. Folks, there are times in our lives, and maybe it's at all times, we need to hear something other than just, "You've got this." We need to hear what Jeremiah heard, and we're going to see, and that is, God's got this. There's a lot more comfort when you're facing what many of you are facing right now. Some of you are getting ready to graduate and saying, "I don't know what the future holds. What's there for me? And maybe I got a little bit of an idea of what the future is, and I just don't think I'm up to it. I'm not sure I can do it." Jeremiah would say to you, God's got this. You know, it's interesting, when Jeremiah was basically saying, "God, I don't have this," God did not say to him, "Now, Jeremiah, look deep down in your soul and just pull up some inner strength that's hidden deep there. Dig down deep and find that latent self-confidence that you've got and bring it to the surface." He didn't tell him to look at himself at all. What he gave him was a glimpse of God himself. Jeremiah, you're right. You don't have this. But God is saying, "I have it." And so what I guess I would hope each of you here this morning, whether you specifically need it right now or you're going to need it sometime in the future, that you hear God whisper to your soul, Yes, it may be a daunting task before you. It may be a very trying situation. But God is telling you, I've got this. And that's what Jeremiah found out. So basically what I'm going to be saying, and this is because this is what Jeremiah is telling us here in his word. Since God sovereignly ordained your beginning, and since he is with you in the present, you can, with great confidence, entrust him with your future. Let that sink in. God has got this thing, and you can rest in that. So let's look at verse 5 here, because basically what he says here in verse 5 is God had this thing in your past. God dealing with you did not begin today, yesterday, when you started school here. It says it even before you were born. This is an amazing fact. Folks, if we could grasp this, God began working his plan for you. That plan that you may be very concerned about in the future. God began to work you before you were ever born. See, he's going to appoint you. See, that happens at the end of verse 5. He's going to appoint you. You know what most of us are waiting for? We're waiting for the appointment. God, what do you want me to do? Open the door for, who's my future spouse, my job, vocation, many other things. Lord, I'm waiting for the appointment. God's going to say, that's great, but there's some things that you need to understand before the appointment came. God was already at work in your life. Look at verse 5 again. It says, God formed you. He says, before I appointed you, I knew you, consecrated, but I formed you. God was working from, by the way, this is an interesting word. It's the same word that God uses in Genesis 2:7, where he says that he took dust from the earth and he formed Adam. Now notice what he was doing. He had a particular plan in mind. He didn't just start working with some clay and say, well, let me see what comes out of this, He had a plan for Adam to be who he was, to be a human being, to live in the Garden of Eden, to be able to marry and procreate and to take care of the garden. Well, God had a plan for him. And so he formed him to where he could fit that plan that God had for him. And friends, that's what God has done for you, even, he says, from the womb. He formed you. And then it says also, he knew you. But before you were born, God knew you. Now, that's, again, an interesting word. It doesn't mean that he knew about you. Now, he did know about you, but that's not what he's saying here. He says, I knew you. That is a very personal, intimate knowledge. Before you were ever born, God had a place in his heart for you. And he had a place in his plan for you. And he formed you to that. He knew you. This is the same word. I like to look back and say this. Look at this. The word is same used in Amos 3, chapter 3, verse 2, where God says of the nation of Israel, out of all the nations of the earth, I only knew you. Well, he knew about all the other nations, but that's not what he meant. Only you have I known in this unique personal relationship to where we are in this covenant relationship. I have known you in an intimate way. Folks, when you were born, God didn't have to call a meeting of the Trinity and say, well, he's here. What are we going to do with him? We got to have some kind of plan for this person. God had the plan from the beginning, and he began to mold and shape you in that early on. And then he says a third thing. He says he consecrated you. Now, that's another wonderful word. It's actually the same word that we a lot of times translate holy. It means he set you apart. He set you aside for a specific purpose. Now, if you look in the Bible, so many things are called holy. The temple was holy. Why was it holy? Because God had set it apart for a specific purpose. There, God was to be worshiped, praised, sacrifices were to be taken. He consecrated that. He set it apart from all other buildings because he had a certain plan and purpose for it. The nation of Israel was a holy nation. Why? because God had a specific plan and purpose for that nation. They were to be a light to the Gentiles. They didn't do that too well. But they were going to be the unique people of God, his covenant people. He had them set apart for a specific plan and purpose. Jerusalem, that's called the holy city. Why was it the holy city? Because God set it apart from all the others because he had a special plan for it. That city was going to be the center of the political and religious life of Israel. It was going to be the city to which the Lord Jesus was going to come, where he was going to be mocked and mistreated, ultimately crucified. It was going to be that city that God set apart for a purpose, where Jesus was going to be crucified and 3 days later was going to be raised from the dead. It was a consecrated city. It was set apart because God had a special plan and purpose for it. Now, friends, let this grab you here. He says the same thing of you, that you were set apart for the purpose. Now you say, set apart from what? You were set apart from everybody else. God made you uniquely. He does. You don't need the gifts that somebody else has to do what God's going to call you to do. You just need to be you. I heard somebody say years ago, you just need to be you, folks. Everybody else is already taken. You just be you. God created you and gifted you to do what he has called you to do. He has set you apart for his plans and purposes in your life. Now, that certainly includes, as we'll see, our vocation. Because it's only after he says, I formed you, I knew you, I consecrated you, I set you apart, and then I appointed you. Now, here's again, interesting word, appoint. It's the same word that's used so many times in the scripture. I just had to pull out an example. The special holy days and the festival days in the Old Testament. God appointed those. He took a special day and said, see that day right there? That's the one I'm choosing. This is going to be the special festival. This is what it's supposed to accomplish. This is how often you're supposed to do it. God appointed those days. And the same word that he says here, Jeremiah, you have been appointed. Now, here's a question. I need to address this here because somebody said, but wait a minute. How are you moving from Jeremiah to us? That's Jeremiah. I'll tell you how I'm moving from Jeremiah to you today. Because God follows the same pattern with his people that he followed with Jeremiah. Same thing, okay? Take particularly, we've talked about the vocation. God called him to something. He prepared him for something. Everything that he did there with Jeremiah, he does us in our unique situation, our vocation. I look at that in particular because that's really what Jeremiah was dealing with here. The question we ought to be asking is not, what do I want to do? The question we need to be asking is, what does God want me to do? We see that God never asked Jeremiah here what Jeremiah wanted to do. In fact, Jeremiah told him what he wanted to do, told him what he didn't want him to do, and God was real unconcerned about his opinion. Okay? He's asking, we need to be asking, what does God want me to do in my vocation? Folks, let me tell you about vocation. The very first address that Dr. Fant gave to the university when he came here, he made this statement. He said, your vocation is not primarily how you make a living. Okay? It is how you make a living, but it is not primarily how you make a living. Your vocation primarily is your way of glorifying Jesus every day that you live. And that's what Jeremiah did, and that's what we are called to do. If we get a hold of that, it transforms our lives. I was talking with a man one time, and I knew he was a deacon in his church, but he asked me, he said, what do you do? I said, I'm an ordained preacher. And he said, man, that's great. He said, I'm an ordained plumber. And I said, what? He said, I'm an ordained plumber. I said, I didn't know we ordained plumbers. He said, we don't. God does. He said, did God call you to be a preacher? I said, yes, sir. He said, do you try to be the best preacher for Jesus that you can possibly be? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, God called me to be a plumber. And I'm the best plumber for Jesus that I can possibly be. Man, that's a person who got a hold of the calling of God on his life. And when we have that experience, every day on our job, regardless of what it is, becomes meaningful because we are not serving ourselves simply or others. We are serving and glorifying the true and living God. So what's he telling us in verse 5? He says, the one who designed your yesterday is not uncertain about your tomorrow. What's another way of saying that? God's got this. That's what he's telling us. But verses 6 through 8 tell us that he's got us in the future. I'll have to move through this very quickly. This formation, by the way, that he's done continues throughout our lives. Experiences that you're having and that you have had, whether they're good or bad, by the way. God allows us to pass through experiences that are molding and shaping us for things that are going to be in our future that we're not even aware of now. He continues that. Okay? But I want you to notice here, I love how God deals with this here. Notice, God recognizes your inadequacy. When you look and say, I just don't know that I'm up to what the future holds for me. What's interesting is God didn't deny what Jeremiah said, well, Lord, I'm just a youth. God didn't say, no, you're not. God knew he was just a youth. And he said, well, I don't know how to speak. God said, I know that. I know you don't know how to. I figured all that in when I called you that you were young and didn't know how to speak. I intend to do something about it. God does not, imagine what Jeremiah was thinking there is, I'm going to tell God I'm young, and I don't know how to speak, and God's going to say, oh, yeah, you do. Yeah, come on, you're a lot better than you think you are. But God said, no, you're exactly right. You're young and don't know how to speak. Well, that's encouraging, isn't it? But God wasn't going to leave it there. He's going to do something about it. He didn't say, when Jeremiah says, well, Lord, you got the wrong person. I'm too young. I don't know how to speak. God didn't say, Jeremiah, I just made the first mistake I ever made. It's not you. I meant to be talking to somebody else. I got the wrong person. He didn't have the wrong person. Jeremiah just needed to understand who he was dealing with God. He paid it no attention here. You see, Jeremiah saw his limitations as being a liability. God doesn't see your limitations as being a liability. He sees them as being an asset. The kind of person that God can use is when he calls them to a task and they say, I'm not up to it. I can't. I am unable. God says, that's exactly the kind of person I'm looking for, because you're going to find out that I am going to enable you through this process. That's lacking self-confidence, but having full God confidence, which in turn gives us biblical self-confidence. So he doesn't recognize the inadequacy. He rejects the excuses. Look at verse 7. He said, there's two things he says here. When Jeremiah says, I can't speak, I'm too young, he said, don't say that again. Don't say that again, Jeremiah. I'm on top of this. I know it. I don't need to hear that. Don't tell me again that you're young, for two reasons. One, I already know it, and second, it's irrelevant. We're going to deal with that. And he does. And then he says, you shall go. This is what you're not going to do. You're not going to say this to me again, but you are going to go wherever I send you. Friends, a great thing to do in determining God's will in the future is start out by saying, God, I want you to know right even before you open the door for me, wherever it is you want me to go, I'm going to do it. I'm going to start out with obedience, and then, Lord, you tell me what to do. And I think a lot of times the reason God hasn't told somebody what he wants them to do is they haven't come to him and said, I'll do whatever you want. Here's a blank slate. You just write on it, and I'll do it. Well, God's ready to open the door to the future for somebody who takes this attitude. Lord, I'll do whatever you want me to do. So he rejects every excuse that you would possibly have, and then he calms our fears. Man, look at verse 8. He says, I'm with you. You know, the more I thought about that, I thought, you know, that right there should have been sufficient. That should have ended the whole conversation. As soon as it got started, and I can't do this, I'm not up to this, I'm afraid. You know, if just that one statement would have sunk in to him, everything would have been okay. What is that? God's with you. Jeremiah says, well, I don't know how to speak. God is with you. Okay? I'm sort of weak and timid. God is with you. Folks, the very God who created the universe, the very God who sustains it, the very powerful God who has all power in heaven and in earth is with you. And you know, it's interesting that when he said that to Jeremiah, all of Jeremiah's objections sort of melted. He didn't have any more objections. How are you going to object to God when he says, it doesn't matter what it is, I'm going to be with you? My friends, listen, if you're a child of God today, God is with you. And so what's he telling us in verses 6 through 8? You know, what he's basically telling us is God does not lose control of your life whenever you feel uncertain and inadequate about your future. How you feel about your future has absolutely nothing to say about God being in control and being trustworthy. Well, he's telling us in so many words, I've got this. I've got this. But then he's also got the future. And boy, that's the main thing that we're concerned about. But how do we can trust him that he's got the future because he had us from the beginning and he's been with us in the present. You can see it. And he is going to be with us in the future. Now, he tells that in verse 9. He says, I've put these words in your mouth. Now, does he mean he did it right then? Or is he promising, when did Jeremiah really get the words? I'll tell you when he got them. When he needed them. When he got up and started to speak, and he spoke, and he probably got through and thought, how did I do that? I'm timid and shy, and I don't know how to speak. How in the world did I do that? You know, he got it when he needed it. God later in his chapter tells him, when Jeremiah says, I'm very timid, I'm very shy, God said, listen, I am going to make you like an iron pillar. And Jeremiah said, I'm not an iron pillar kind of guy. You know, don't make me do that. I'm going to make you like a bronze wall. You're going to stand against the whole nation, the kings, the priests, the prophets, everybody. And he said, I'm not that kind of guy. I'm not that kind of stand strong guy. God said, don't say that. When did he become that? He became that when he needed it. When the time came, he needed to be able to speak. So what God do? Gives him words. He says, I need courage. I'm timid. What do I need? I need courage. God gave him courage. You see, the empowerment comes to us in obedience. In the act of obedience, the empowerment then comes, and that's what he had to trust the Lord for, that when the time comes, it's going to be there. And that's because God's got this thing. Now, I need to be perfectly honest with you folks, because what I can picture here, if we don't tell the whole story, is we can look at Jeremiah and we can say, boy, his life just turned up like a bed of roses. You know, God called him and God equipped him, and man, he just was in God's will all the way through, and he just stayed faithful. I bet he had a bed of roses for a life. Nothing could be further from the truth. This man had difficulties. He had troubles. His own family at one time tried to kill him. You know, he was put in the stocks and made fun of. He was thrown in a well and left to die. Would have died had somebody not come along and got him out. You say, you mean in all that while he was serving God? Yes. Folks, that doesn't set well with the prosperity gospel. Okay? Everything's going to be all right. When God opens that door to your future and you walk through it in faithfulness, it does not mean that everything is going to be to your liking. Jeremiah went through difficult times, and God did not promise him otherwise. He promised him, I will be with you. And that's enough. You see, there are people today, Christians, people who were brought up in a Christian home. And I know went to Christian universities. And they were serving God until something didn't go their way. Something didn't turn out the way they thought it should. And you know what that really boils down to? It boils down to this. They didn't believe God's got this. That was the problem. You know, I don't like what God did here. And I'm surprised. You know, the Bible warns us of this over and over again. No clearer place than 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12. He said, do not be surprised when you go through fiery trials and troubles as if something strange were happening to you. If you're a believer and you're going through trials and troubles as you will in the future, that is not a strange thing that is happening to you. That is part of God's plan that is molding and shaping you into the image of Christ. It is preparing you for what God has in store for you. So just because you get in His will and things don't turn out the way you thought, God is not surprised, and He is telling us, don't think something strange is happening. Don't think things are out of God's control. Don't think that God does not have power to change things. Do not think that God does not have the wisdom to know what He is doing. Trust Him completely in all things. Now, if Jeremiah were here today, based on what we've just read and his life experiences, what would he say to us? What would Jeremiah say if he was standing here? I think he would say two things. First of all, you shouldn't be surprised, God's got this. That's the first thing he'd tell us. I can tell you from my experience, God's got this. The second thing he would say is you trust and obey. You trust and obey because God has got this. Since God ordained your beginning and stands with you in the present, you can entrust your future to Him with confidence. The Scripture is very clear. No one who has put their confidence in Him has ever been disappointed. That's because God doesn't disappoint people. When you look at your life and you look at your future, even from the standpoint where you are right now, please hear God say to you, I've got this. Stand with me if you would. Father, if you would simply give us a vision of your glory today, all will be well.